أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين رحمة للعالمين بالقاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يؤتي الحكمة من يشاء ومن يؤتى الحكمة فقد أوتي خيرا كثيرا. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وعلى محمد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. There's a very famous hadith which says that Mawtul alimi, Mawtul alami. The death of the scholar is the death of the universe. It's a very profound. Why would a death of just one scholar be a death of the whole universe? It's a profound tradition. What is emphasized is not only the knowledge of a scholar, but more importantly, the role that that scholar plays in the lives of the people. Because the role of the scholar is not merely to tell you what the book says or what it means. It's also to influence, to shape, and to mold your life. It's important, therefore, that any scholar, for that matter, has to come up with material or issues which are A, relevant to the needs of the time, and B, not tied to history. Many times I find, especially in our syllabus, that there are those who just do commentary after commentary, sharh after sharh. Because some scholar in the 10th century wrote something, another scholar comes and writes a commentary on that. Whereas commentary is important, but what happens is when we write commentary upon a commentary of a commentary, then we stifle original thinking. Because Islam always says that it is a religion of practicality, of pragmatism. So, whereas it is important to write a commentary, but when you focus only on the commentary, the new thinking, you cannot think outside the box, as they say. Nor can you think fresh. History is important for sure, but we're supposed to learn from history, not to be bound to history. There are those who are always talking about history. Ibn Khaldun, a very famous sociologist, says that when we blindly follow the ancient customs and ancient traditions, it does not mean that the dead are alive. It means that those who are alive are dead. When we blindly follow ancient traditions and customs, and traditions does not mean that the dead are alive. It actually means that those who are alive are dead. Especially in our school, the madhab of the Ahlul Bayt, aql is very important. Contrary to other Muslims who believe that we only know what is right and what is wrong based on what has been revealed, we say the opposite. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Ra'isul Uqala, we call him. He is the highest form of thinker because he gave us aql. And therefore we know what is right and what is wrong. We know the basics, not because Allah said so, but because our reason says so. Allah would never give you a device, put a device in your mind and then tell you not to use it. If you don't use it, then what's the point of giving it to me in the first place? So therefore, aql is very important in our understanding, in our knowledge. The Quran came to enhance the intellect, not to replace the intellect, to make it even go further. And since we are talking about knowledge and the role that it plays, and the alim, the role that he and even as she plays in the community, we should also understand that knowledge not only informs us, but more importantly, knowledge is supposed to reform us. We always think of a knowledgeable person as someone who is informative. No doubt there is information. But more important than information is reformation. How we as human beings can be reformed through that knowledge. Especially in the West, you will have noticed when it comes to secular knowledge, people seek power from knowledge. The more knowledgeable you are, the more powerful you become. That's in the Western understanding. Look at it. Even today we can see that the more advanced we are in terms of science, the more inhumane the West has become. They're not only talking of killings, they're talking of mass killings now. Gone are the days of guns. Now we're talking of drones, of missiles, and so on. In other words, the more knowledge that people have, at least some people, the more powerful they think that they are. Whereas the Quran reminds us that Allah is a witness of everything and He knows everything. And one day, you'll be brought to account for everything. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alayhi. In the Islamic understanding, we do not seek power from knowledge. We seek salvation from knowledge. We seek how to become better human beings from knowledge. How to appreciate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from that knowledge. Not that how we can become better and more powerful and dominate and kill others. Not in the Islamic understanding. Yeah, you need to defend yourself, but you do not need to offend others. And therefore you'll recall that in the dua of Asr that we have received from Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min ilmin la yanfa. Oh my Lord, protect me from that knowledge which does not benefit me. Don't give me that knowledge. Protect me from that knowledge which does not benefit me. And you do not have to be an alim the way we understand, by the way. Anybody who knows anything in any science is an alim. For example, you are studying biology. You go into biology and you study insects and you see how very well they are connected, how harmonized they are. That also makes you an alim. You appreciate the workings of Allah. You are an astronomer. You look at the galaxy and how the Quran, if you look at Surah Al-Mulk, Surah number 67, the Quran challenges us. ثُمَّ ارْجِ الْبَصَرِ. Then look again in the heavens. هَلْ تَرَى مِنْ فُطُورٍ? Do you see anything that is broken away or which is in disharmony? In other words, just that knowledge of the creation of Allah in itself makes you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The verse in chapter 30, Surah Ar-Rum, that you must have recited only yesterday, verse 22, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Amongst the signs of Allah is the creation of the heavens and the earth. وَاخْتِلَافِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ. And the fact that your tongues, in other words, your language, your colors are different, we are different, we appear different, we speak differently, that in itself is a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the verse doesn't end there. Inna fi dhalika la ayatin lil alimin. I've heard people say lil alamin. It's not alamin here, it's alimin. In other words, this is a sign for those who know. In other words, when you know, you appreciate the workings of Allah in its different forms, whether it is in the heavens, on the earth, in the animals, in human beings. That makes you an alim also. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala. The story is told of one of the great Sunni philosophers, is Ghazali. Ghazali died in a year that you cannot forget, 1111. You can't forget that, huh? 1111, the year he died. But Ghazali was in the desert with his books. He was traveling and he was caught by some robbers. And they took away everything, including his books. Ghazali said, please don't take away my books. He said, why not? He says, first of all, these books, you will not benefit from them. And B, you take my books from me, you take away my knowledge also. And the robbers laughed at him and said, what kind of knowledge is this that we can take it away from you so easily, huh? If that is what all you know. Because knowledge is not supposed to reside in the mind only. It's supposed to reside in your heart. Because then you can actually interiorize that knowledge. And therefore there's a very famous hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The hadith says, Al-ulama warathatul anbiya. The scholars are the inheritors of the anbiya. In other words, they inherit the legacy of the prophets. And what is the legacy of the prophets? It's knowledge. I remember, just to give you a personal example, of what the concept of knowledge is in the Islamic framework. About 40 odd years ago, I was in Qom. I was a student there in the Hawza. And I had some what we call Darse Azadi. In other words, free studies, whereby you go to a scholar and he teaches you, not only through the institution, but what we call free studies. And I thought, coming from a Western framework, that you have to pay for it. After all, nothing comes free. So I went to the scholars and I offered them some hadiah, as we call it. And they looked at me and they laughed and said, "What is this?" I said, "This is my way of appreciating what you have done." They said, "That may be the Western way. It's not our way." I said, "Well, what can I do for you?" He says, "Our way is this, is that whatever we teach you, you transmit it to others. Whatever you learn, you give it to others. That is the only and best way that you can appreciate. Because what we know, we got it from our teachers, who got it from their teachers, who got it from the imams, who got it from the Prophet. And of course, who got it from Allah." In other words, knowledge is the legacy that we pass on to each other. The alim then is an inheritor of the Prophet because he or she has learned the knowledge from or through the other people originating from the Prophet himself. Why does the Prophet say that the ulama warathatul anbiya? The ulama are the inheritors of the Prophet because they are the link between the text, the books, and the conscience of the community. The community doesn't go towards the books because they have other things to do. Most of us do not even understand Arabic or Persian, but it's the ulama who are the bridge. But it's not only a question of learning and telling you, it's a question of telling you how to relate to that knowledge in your own times, not only what was in the past. Now, alim is not only one who informs you, but also feels the pain and the suffering of the ummah. In other words, he is with you in your pains. And therefore, especially in the madhab of the Ahlul Bayt, we have the concept of ijtihad. You've heard of it, a mujtahid. Ahlul Sunnah do not have mujtahids now. They used to have in the past. They have more muftis. But ijtihad, what is ijtihad? It is mental jihad, if you like. Because the word jihad is in the word ijtihad. Ijtihad is, if you like, mental activity that helps you think. Not only does ijtihad make you think, it also makes you rethink. Not only does it help you form an opinion, ijtihad helps you form an opinion, but also to reform that opinion. As you learn more and you research more, you reform that opinion. Remember this much, my sisters and brothers, I always say, that a community which stops thinking starts sinking. The moment you stop thinking, you start sinking. And therefore this is part of ijtihad, that our knowledge, our laws must change according to the circumstances. There are issues which are arriving now, which we are faced with now, which were not there during the times of the imams. In other words, the law covers things, but not everything. There are large sections where the law is, which is called mantiq al-faragh. Mantiq al-faragh is where the law is largely absent. There is no law, at least not in the hadith, on IVF, on DNA, for example, transgender surgery, trade unions, or the type of government that a community should adopt. It is the ulama who rethink, who form an opinion on issues that were not there before. An important dimension that we often neglect is that the ulama, the scholars, must be free and independent to think. Mutahari says this, not me. He says that we have an emotional rather than a rational Islam. Islam is supposed to be a rational religion. Yes, emotions are important. We cannot deny that. But more importantly, for knowledge to be able to express, we need to have a rational, not just an emotional Islam. in many ways, and you may agree or disagree with me on this, many have found that we have more freedom here in the West than in our own Muslim countries. Even the freedom to worship. You can worship the way that you like here. You go to Saudi Arabia, for example, or to the Taliban countries and see how you can worship there. As a Shia, you'll be shocked at what they do to you. So in many ways, we have the freedom to think, to worship here in the West. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alayhi. Remember this, my sisters and brothers. The Prophet came. Not only would he preach, not only would he teach, but more importantly, he would reach the people. It's not only a question of preaching and teaching. That's just part of it. But reaching the hearts and the minds of the people. And therefore, there are those who have distinguished between an alim and a Roshan Fikr. Alim is just a scholar. Roshan Fikr is what we call enlightened minds. People who are enlightened. If you look at the Quran very carefully, the Quran talks of not only of ilm, but hikmah, wisdom. Wisdom is something over and above knowledge. So the Quran says, chapter 2, verse 269, this is the verse that I recited at the beginning of this lecture. يُعْطِي الْحِكْمَةِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. Allah gives hikmah to whoever He wishes. وَمَنْ يُعْطَى الْحِكْمَةِ فَقَدْ أُوتِيَ خَيْرًا كَثِيرًا. Whoever has been given that wisdom has been given a lot of virtue. Whoever has been given that wisdom has been given a lot of virtue. The Quran never says that about knowledge, because knowledge is different from hikmah. Knowledge is stored in the books, on the shelves, in the encyclopedia, whereas wisdom is stored in your heart. Knowledge generates encyclopedia, whereas wisdom generates an enlightened being, a Roshan Fikr as we go. And therefore, you will notice a very famous verse in the Quran, chapter 16, Surah An-Nahl, verse 125, where Allah says, "Ud'u ila rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'idatil hasana." He's telling us how to talk to non-Muslims. He says, invite them with hikmah. Knowledge is important, but more important is the wisdom of how to approach, how to reach not only their minds, but also their hearts. And therefore the Quran says, "Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'idatil hasana." Invite people to the path of your Lord with hikmah and beautiful preaching. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alayhi. Again, to go back to the Islamic tradition of knowledge, there is a very close connection between the teacher and the student. In the West here, we don't have that much close connection between the teacher and the student. In the West, you are known by where you studied. Now, you studied at Princeton or my own McMaster, or maybe in Boston, Massachusetts, etc., Ivy League. Then you are well off, you are better, more acknowledged. In the Islamic tradition, we judge not by where you studied, but who you studied under, who you studied with. And therefore, you will notice also that normally when a person has finished studying in the East, he is given an ijazah. I'm not talking of ijazah of khums, the ijazah of ijtihad. That this person has studied under me and is now competent to exercise or undertake ijtihad. But there is something else. That ijazah comes with an acknowledgement by the teacher that this person is also morally upright. Because in the Islamic tradition, it's not only knowledge that comes from the teacher to the student, it's the personality of the teacher that is imbibed in the student. And therefore, it is said that a famous sage, a very famous wise guy, was asked, "Why do you love your teacher more than your parents?" Why do you love your teacher more than your parents? He said, "My parents brought me from up there to down here. My teacher took me from down here to up there." And whenever you take somebody from, it works against gravity. Huh? Whenever you take somebody from the earth, in other words, he not only taught me, he nourished my soul. And therefore, we always look from an alim, not only what he knows, but how he behaves with others. Taqwa is as important in the Islamic tradition as ilm. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alim. Because an alim is supposed to speak not only to your mind, but also to your heart. He moves and touches your soul. Interestingly, when you look at the Quran, the very famous verse that you must have heard many, many times, أَفَلَا يَتَدَّبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَىٰ أُقُولِهِمْ أَقْفَالُهَا don't they ponder over the Quran? أَمْ عَلَىٰ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ أَقْفَالُهَا Or are there locks on their hearts? In other words, the Quran says there must be locks in the hearts for them for not to fathom the Quran. The Quran is not supposed to reach your aql only, my friends. More importantly, it's supposed to reach your heart. And therefore it says, are their hearts locked? It doesn't say, are their aql locked? The alim then informs and reforms. We often think that we get close to Allah by our ritual practices, by what we pray, we fast. Those are important, no doubt. But yet many a time haven't you found that we perform the rituals and yet we are distant from Allah. We don't feel that closest to Allah. That closest to Allah comes through moral and spiritual development. My sisters and brothers, today, especially when we are living in the West, we are searching for a new language. And that language, I'm not talking about Arabic or English or what. I'm talking about the language of the Quran. The language of the Quran, as I understand it, is twofold: universality and morality. You will find that the Quran talks more about values than about laws. The laws in the Quran are hardly 5, maybe 600 verses. It talks more about how you should behave than what you should know. It talks about ethics and morality far more than about the law. We find this language of universality and morality in the Quran. Universality means how we behave with all human beings. And that behavior must be on a common moral language of ethics and morality. And therefore you'll find the Quran does not, when it comes to morality, when it comes to how we behave, it does not distinguish between Muslims and non-Muslims. It says, you save one human being, you save the whole of humanity. You kill one innocent being, you've killed the whole of humanity. It doesn't say that you save one Muslim. It says, Man qatala nafsan bighayri nafsin aw fasadi fil ard. When you kill one innocent soul, you've killed the whole of humanity. Other verses to show the universal language of the Quran that we need to adopt. وَلَا تَسُبُّوا الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ فَيَسُبُّوا اللَّهَ عُدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. Do not revile, do not insult those who believe in other gods. We're not talking about cursing. We're talking about reviling, disparaging, insulting. Because if you insult their gods, they will insult your God in return. To go even further, how we should even not only behave, but even talk. قُلْ لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا, the Quran says. Speak in a beautiful way to whom? Anas, to the people. وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. Again from the Quran. When you talk to non-Muslims, talk to them in the most beautiful way. Not in a beautiful way, but in the most beautiful way. This is the language of universality, of morality. I don't think Mr. Trump is listening to this, but this is a verse about amnesty, refugees, immigrants, if you like. Because this is an issue that was discussed by the Quran 1400 years ago. The Quran says, وَإِنْ أَحَدٌ مِّنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ إِسْتَجَارَكَ. If one mushrik, we're not even talking of a kafir, a mushrik comes to you seeking protection, O Prophet, what should we do? Tell them, no, you're not a Muslim? On the contrary, it commands us It doesn't recommend us. It commands us, فَأَجِرْهُ حَتَّى يَسْمَعَ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ. Then give them protection so that they can hear the words of Allah through you. In other words, you become an ambassador of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The way that you treat them, even though they are mushriks. حَتَّى يَسْمَعَ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ. This is in Surah Tawbah, Surah number 9, verse 6. Check it out. And I must admit, I was stunned when I read this verse. I said, oh my God, this is what the Quran is telling us about refugees, about those who do not have a place to go to. Because when we reject refugees, we are actually rejecting humanity. There are people who need, and we need to help them out. My sisters and brothers, my time is running short, but I need to make 1 or 2 points before I finish. Today, knowledge has become more fragile. When I was a student, I was told very clearly and continuously, there are 2 aspects of knowledge, and this applies in any field, by the way, not only religion. Whether you study computers or accountancy or IP or whatever it is they teach these days. 2 aspects, breadth and depth. In other words, what you know, you should know it properly, deeply. And also, you should know a wide range. Don't just what we call a wishy-washy or queche scholar. You should be deeply embedded in whatever you learn. But in today's world, I do not know whether you have noticed it, especially religious knowledge has become very fragile because of the internet, because of social media. People go on the internet, pick up a hadith here, a verse from the Quran there, and suddenly they are scholars. On the contrary, what happens is knowledge is supposed to be vertical, not horizontal. In other words, you go to study from those who are more knowledgeable than you. Not just going on the internet and picking up verses here and hadith here and there. What has happened many a time is that the madrasa or the school of learning, the hawza, has been bypassed because people who just go on the internet. Charisma has replaced substance. What we're looking for in knowledge is substance. Not a person who can speak very well, but is very shallow or misinterprets the message of the Ahlul Bayt. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So knowledge then is become more and more fragile. The circulation is between equals rather than between those who know and those who do not know. That's why you find, especially amongst the Ahlul Sunnah, by the way, amongst them, you go on a Friday prayer, you'll find some guy who's an engineer, pharmacist, sitting or standing on the mimbar and giving khutbah. Right? How come I don't go and speak to pharmacists and accountants? Because that's not my field. But when it comes to religion, mashallah, everybody is an expert. Or somebody said correctly, I will not mention where and who said it, but it says, here in Africa, if you throw a stone in the air, it's bound to land on a mujtahid. Because everybody suddenly is a mujtahid suddenly. My sisters and brothers, my message is this. An eternal Allah, an eternal God, speaks eternally. He doesn't speak only to the 7th century Arabs. We as human beings, our tendency is to pass judgments on others. This guy's going to go to heaven, this guy's going to go to hell, etc. But on the contrary, the Quran tells us the opposite. It tells the Prophet, فَإِنَّمَا عَلَيْكَ الْبَلَاغُ وَعَلَيْنَا الْحِسَابُ. Upon you, O Prophet, is to deliver the message. We will do the accounting. We got it slightly the wrong way around. Huh? We tell Allah, you deliver your message, we will do the accounting. No. On the contrary, the Quran says the opposite. It says we do not compete for religion. Don't compete for religion, compete for virtue. فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. Compete on who does the best deeds for the sake of getting close to Allah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.